Good evening and welcome to this month's Creative Conversation. I'm Jody Thorne. I'm from Prism Sound, and it is my absolute pleasure this month to introduce the jazz legend that is Courtney Pine OBE CBE. Good evening, Courtney.
Good evening, Jody. Thanks for doing this. And
No problem. Our absolute pleasure. It's our honor.
I'm more of a legend than a legend.
Do you know what? It shows our age because I know what you're talking about.
Yes. So how's it going?
So, not too bad. Yourself?
I'm in the middle of recording at the moment. I'm going through that creative process. I'm on the verge of creativity, on the edge of the cliff, that bit just before registering what dark matter is that we do in the recording world.
Right. Yeah, that is the thing. It's the magic that makes it all happen. Before we sort of get too deep into our conversation this evening, I just want to mention to everybody, both Courtney and I are having, wherever you are in the world, we're having pretty much gale force storms outside both our houses at the moment. So if our internet is a little bit up and down, we do apologise.
I should record this. I should get out a Neumann and try and record this scale. It's amazing how it sound out there.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But hey, you could put it in one of your albums. You know, put it as
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So for those of you watching live this evening, we are taking questions. Obviously, we'll be going through our normal conversation. For those of you who watched before, we'll be doing our normal chat this evening. But if anybody you want to have any questions that you want answering, please just put it in the comments field that you can see online. So to begin with, Courtney, now, first question, was it always your ambition to work in music? Because I believe your initial career trajectory was a little bit further afield. If my research serves me correctly, I believe you wanted to be an astronaut.
I wanted to be a space cadet. Yeah, I was all up in the NASA. I wanted to be on one of them Gemini rockets, and I just loved the idea of going to a place that hadn't been before, and I loved the idea of the technology. Even back then, I was a big fan of Lost in Space and just finding new frontiers, and I think that's why I fell into jazz music, because that's what happens in jazz. The boundaries are the limits of your imagination. But yeah, I definitely wanted to be a scientist of some sort.
So basically, what led you down this career trajectory then?
Well, music plays a big part in my culture, in my upbringing. And back in the 60s, we lived in a one-room apartment with everything in there. One of those paraffin little petrol heaters, which was quite tall. It's weird because now they're quite small because I've got taller.
Yeah.
And we had the sink, the bath, the iron bath, but there was this thing in the corner of the room. I think it was the biggest thing in the room apart from the bed, which is, we call it a gramophone, and on it, women would do knit doilies and stuff, and you'd have gin bottles in there and souvenir bits of Jamaica, and it was the standout piece in the room. And what would happen is you'd have this thing called a turntable, and the turntable you'd be able to stack up to 10 records, and they would drop down one by one, and the needle would come across and play the track. And families would come over to make sure that you were all right. They would come and visit. So I had families coming down from Birmingham or from South London just to make sure we were all okay. And they would be sitting down at the dinner table, the pork pie hat down on the table, some vodka and some rum, and lots of conversation. And this music would be playing. And I can actually remember standing next to this massive gramophone show where the music was coming out the speakers, and holding on to the side and feeling the vibrations. And I think that was the first incentive for me to be associated with controlling, dispersing, altering resonances, frequencies, aka making music. But that was the first time it happened, and I realized that something traveled through the ether, something traveled through the ear and tickled your pineal gland, you know, and it made you want to be creative. How did this happen? How did they do this? On these records, on the flip side, there was another track. So the first side had this, what I thought was a dodgy vocal, but the flip side had an instrumental version. And these guys were making more interesting sounds, were making more interesting convolutions or frequencies for me. I later found out that these guys were jazz musicians. So they would do jazz shifts at night and come to studio and work for Coxon or who, you know, the name producer in Jamaica, and create this thing called ska and reggae music. And I really appreciated what Don Drummond, the trombonist, Tommy McCook, Roland Alfonso, Ernest Ranglin. These are jazz musicians, and what they did with music really fascinated with me. And on more research, I realized what they were doing was tapping into the community energy, finding the right tempos that people were dancing to, finding the right keys that made people move, finding the right arrangements that work within the limitations of the 3 minutes. It was just amazing. I didn't know at the time. It was just a great sound and a great energy. But more research, and I realized that what these guys were doing was an amazing science. Yes, okay, we call it reggae and ska and blue beat, dancehall music. But for human beings to be able to do that and to create in physical sound a vibe, an emotion, it's just fascinating. And I'm still trying to do that to this day.
Fantastic. So obviously, you know, you talk about ska, you talk about reggae. Were those your major influences when you were obviously growing up, you know, or was it that you understand that there's a lot of musicians out there who have a diverse range or portfolio of music that they've listened to that have influenced their creative flow over the years? But would you say that you're mainly influenced by those musicians that you just described?
Not really, because I was born in London,
right?
And it's an amazing cosmopolitan city. And at that time in the 60s, we had an influx of people from all over the world living in some very harsh climates, but finding some positivity out of that. We did have an amazing popular music scene. And I can remember listening to a lot of music. I can remember my first day of school where Tony Blackburn played Say a Little Prayer by Aretha Franklin. And those were the days, my friends, by Julie. Oh, I can't remember her name. But I can remember the playlist of whilst I was tying up my shoelaces, getting to go to school. I can remember that day clearly. So the music that I was listening to was across the board. You know, we had a Top of the Pops back in those days, which would play music across the board. And where I grew up in is a place called Ladbroke Grove, aka Notting Hill, aka Paddington. I can remember walking through Portobello Road Market and seeing George Melly in a black and white striped suit standing on the side of the road. That actually, Portobello Road was an amazing energy, amazing mixture of cultures. And I was there pulling a trolley for my mum and absorbing all of this. So I think that's the place where I grew up in played a huge part in terms of what was acceptable. You know, I think classical music wasn't really a big part of my 60s of my, you know, first 10 years of my life, but I was aware of it, and throughout the 70s became more and more ever aware of what British music is, you know. So to just say that to think that my music was just from the Caribbean or Africa is not right, because the United Kingdom is a mixture of so many different frequencies and cultures, menus, you know, languages, and you can either choose to absorb them all, or, you know, just let them pass you by. And I've chosen to absorb them all.
Yeah, and I think that's what all the, you know, the people that I've come across over my career working for Prism and studios and stuff, that's what you find is most enriching about the people that have gone on to bigger and greater things, is they have taken every culture and every genre of music, and they've just how can I put it, morphed with it, because they've gone, actually, I'll use this genre or that culture for this album, and then actually I want to take a different direction for the next album, and I want to absorb, like you say, absorb this and go in this direction. And it's that constant change that makes musicians and, you know, albums interesting. I think it's that sort of tried and stayed format that is when it gets a little bit boring sometimes.
Yeah. You know, wisdom is a funny thing, and they say wisdom comes with age. But what you learn, one of the lessons you learn is that the actual instrument stays the same. And whether that's a trombone or a triangle or, you know, a Neve desk or, I don't know, you know, whatever that hardware is that you use, you find that stays the same. After a couple of years or months or minutes of pursuing an understanding of what that instrument, that piece does, something changes. And wisdom declares that it's you that changes. You've actually developed yourself and absorbed or deleted or filtered or found a way to transform yourself into something that has more of an understanding of what the possibilities of that physical thing can do. The actual instrument, whether it's a saxophone in my case, stays the same. It's you that change.
Yeah. And, you know, at the end of the day, change is a great thing. And we've seen that in worst case scenario over the last 2 years, because we've all had to change in the last 2 years.
Oh, extremely. Yeah. We've all had to really adapt. And I have to just shout out to any musician that's out there that's kept up with it, because a lot of us play music because of our community. We play and know that there's a gig next week, or the reasons why we're performing is from a community base. And for a minute there, wow, the communities became really, really small and isolated. And some of us got out there and still played, you know, stuck to it. And we're seeing the fruits of that, you know, and anybody that did, my hat's off to them, because that's some real courage to stick with it. I mean, guys will say, oh, you're just a musician and you play an instrument, you know, but, you know, sometimes you can lose focus, you know. It can be a very depressing thing if you don't have the muse or the energy to continually try and represent your community, especially if the community is not there.
Yeah. And do you find that's difficult? You know, it's interesting that we've kind of gone down this route, because it's you know, while we're going on this trajectory, I think let's explore this for a bit. Do you think it's been difficult for musicians to, you know, like yourself, you're a musician, you're a songwriter, you're a producer, you do your own some engineering, you do a lot of different things, but in all of those aspects, you know, you play off the crowd. So if you're doing a live gig, you play off the audience. If you're working in the studio, all right, you've not got so many people there, but you've got other people that come in and out and that you rely on, you bounce ideas off. But we've been in a situation where that really hasn't been possible. So
Yeah.
how have you managed to sort of maintain that enthusiasm for music as a whole?
Well, first of
And
all,
also,
I'm a jazz musician. I'm a improvising musician. I'm a musician that, like, for example, I don't know what you're going to ask me, you know, but my brain is working before, present, and future, you know. So as a jazz artist, I play songs and I look at the audience in the, you know, and I see when they start to dance, or see when they start to yawn, or see when they react to a certain thing. And I record that in my mind. And then I take that back to the studio and I personify that into sound. You know, it's simple as that. So if you take one of those elements away, the audience, it just stops. The engine just stops. And there's been great stories. Sidney Bechet, the great jazz musician, soprano saxophonist, from New Orleans. We're talking about like 1920s. You know, we're talking old school. He did a record in, I think it was in the 30s, where he played all the instruments. Sidney Bechet's one-man band, and the Musicians Union in America banned it because they were so scared. I mean, we're talking way before Cubase and Pro Tools and Logic and all that. But Sidney could play drums, he could play bass, he could play saxophone, he could play piano. And he does this one track, it's called the Shake of Araby. It's a fantastic track. But they all said, you know, this is heresy. You can't do that. But he found a way of doing it. And there's something about the creative spirit, you know, when you find something that hasn't been, you haven't done before, it inspires you, you know. And it is a simple mathematical equation. You just put two elements together and you get a third element. If you mix it in the right flux, in the right density, in the right, using the right amount of energy, you'll get a third new element. So a lot of jazz musicians, a lot of African musicians, a lot of traditional musicians use this concept all the time. So whether that's a mixing of languages, people, mixings of components, you find that you get this new spark, and that will lead you to a new form of exploration. It's a cognitive thought, and it's not confined to just one specific thing. I think it's very human to be doing this, and for me, the musicians that can capture that spirit and use that as their motto will survive and be courageous enough, because you have to be courageous to do this. It's very easy to sit down a piece of music and sight read it and read the manual, but what's beyond is when you go out of the page, out of the box, as they keep saying, cliched as it is, and find something unique. And then you keep going in that direction, into that unknown area. And that's what jazz constantly does, you know. And I think in this day and age, especially with what we're going through, those musicians who are able to realize that music is that creative spark are the ones that will still find something to do, you know?
So with that in mind, have you, like, because I've spoken to people over the last 12 months, 18 months, who have found creative ways to collaborate, whether that's using FTP sites or whether that's network protocols to allow them to work over the internet. Have you found any ways of collaborating through technological advancement that's allowed you to maintain creativity, but with other individual musicians?
No, I have to admit, I went the opposite way. I just fell flat. I was totally depressed. I just didn't want to. I couldn't see the point of making music, you know. And that's not because of the commercial gains, because as a jazz musician, there's not much commercial gains, and even popular gains. Even, you know, I'm one of Britain's most celebrated jazz musicians for some strange reason. But I didn't go into jazz to become celebrated or to become famous. I went to jazz to become creative with music. And So I just didn't want to play. I just didn't see the point. One of my most recent instruments I picked up is a bass flute. And the bass flute, when you play it, after you finish playing it, you feel transformed. There are some instruments that when you play them and you put it down, you come out of it feeling different. And the bass flute did that for me. So I just went into a bass flute kind of mode. I didn't reach out to anybody. I noticed a couple of my jazz colleagues were doing, like I mentioned, the Sidney Bechet record. They were doing the solo record where they would play everything. And of course, I have to say they all sounded terrible. You know, it's a funny thing. Ego is a funny thing. You know, you think you can play and then you listen to it and it's like, oh my goodness. But, you know, there's, as you know, 5 people in a room playing on the bandstand sounds better than 1 person in the room playing on the bandstand. And I mean, we've had great musicians in the past, like Stevie Wonder, who played all the instruments over a 6-month period. He would do all the tracks and come out with a fantastic recording. I understand that. But there's nothing like hearing a great band play, you know, whether it's the Beatles or the John Coltrane Quartet or Miles Davis's band with Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter. There's nothing like hearing a live band play, you know, and feel that energy. But, you know, for me personally, I just couldn't get with it. And for a couple of months there, it was cut and dry. I was going to be, I don't know, I was going to find plan B, actually plan C. Plan B is becoming an engineer.
Right.
Or a piano tuner or something. I don't know, plan D or E or M or X or Y. One of those plans where it wasn't to do with anything in the music industry in terms of being creative.
Right.
It just didn't seem important anymore. You know, it was the least important thing on my mind. Survival, basically, like everybody else on the planet. We really didn't know what was going on. I was there watching those clips of people spitting on lift buttons and, you know, going through all that horror shows of like, what is this thing and how are we going to get out of it? I have to admit, though, prior to this, some ingenious companies had set up the forums so that you could exchange material to guys in Australia, to guys around the world. So we seem to be going in this kind of way anyway. And in the jazz world, I do jazz broadcasting. So I was doing a radio show for BBC Two, and I had a couple of records from America where guys literally were on 4 corners of America overdubbing, and then they mix it and then send it to me to play on the radio. So we kind of are going that way. And once again, I mentioned the Sidney Bechet story. So yes, we as human beings will always find a way to be creative. But I personally was very disillusioned, and it took a couple of sessions on the bass flute to really find that that point of return where the act of creating and making music and then performing it in front of an audience and transforming it came back, you know, because it was quite a while before we had live shows.
Yeah. So interesting enough. So a couple of questions on that then. So you've mentioned a number of artists, and you know, I know this is a difficult question for you to answer because it'd be difficult for me to answer, let alone for you to answer. But I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
You know, there's one band that you'd say now, like right now, that you could say, I'd go and see them, and if they were playing, I would go and see them right now because they just lift you up. They take you to a new plane. They're, you know, every time I see them, it rejuvenates my passion for music. You know, who would that be?
Oh man, there's been so many bands. But Arcade Fire from Canada.
Right.
I came in one night after a show, and I think they were doing Glastonbury or something, and they had a bass clarinet and a French horn as their horn section. Huh?
Right.
That was incredible. I mean, you couldn't hear it, but
Yeah.
it was just that their mind, their creativity had stretched, and
Yeah.
the lead singer was playing a hurdy-gurdy. That sound that they did, that they've evolved. I mean, I'd love to have dinner with those guys. It's just fantastic that, and if you had no expense and you could just be creative, what would you do? And I think Arcade Fire is that band. I'd love to go and see them play live. They just have an amazing energy with what they do, and their creativity is not just one dimensional. It's not the X gene or the Y gene. It's just everything. You know, It's not just classical and jazz. It's not just rock. It's not just French. It's not just English. It's everything, and it's so nice to see that being done, because you have to be courageous to make those steps. So yeah, I mean, tomorrow it'll probably be somebody else.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of what you know, the music industry is that today it's this, tomorrow it's that, next week it might be something else. So, when did you get back to playing live?
I had some engagements in March of last year, and they were all curtailed and postponed, and then I had a show in Bexhill in September, so which was an outdoor festival. So it took all that time, September of last year, to get back to doing doing shows, and that was to like 3,500 people outdoors, for safety, and Incognito, Snowboy. I can't remember who else. Somebody else was on the bill. It was an all-day festival, outdoor festival. And one of the nice things about jazz is that it's not just about that guy playing that note or that guy playing the trumpet. You know, it's a festive occasion. And I drove down to Bexhill from London and walked through the crowd, and just people, first of all, recognizing me, which I still find surprising. And saying, you know, when are you getting on? And we come all the way to see you play. And it was just such a nice energy. And then when we actually hit the stage and played, it was just an explosion of expression, not just from us as musicians, because we hadn't played together. And the group of musicians I play with play in a way which is non-egotistical. So we don't really have to rehearse. We kind of know, and there's a lot of telepathy that goes on. So there was no rehearsals. We just hit the first note. It all went wrong, and we all tried to make the wrong notes right. And the audience just laughed and cheered, and they got with it. It was just so nice to see. But it did take a while. And that was probably a year and a half of not playing, maybe 2 years of not playing, in actual fact.
Yeah. But do you find, and this is I know this is a very difficult question for a musician to answer, but if you look back in history, and you mentioned the Beatles, and you look at some of their recordings, and you know, most people listen to it and go, sounds amazing. And you go, yeah, but did you notice this mistake and that mistake and that mistake? And that's the beauty of it. It's not perfect.
Yeah.
It's not perfect. Yeah. And there's a lot of musicianship out there that, and you may have a different opinion on this, and it'd be interesting to hear what you've got to say, but that some people try and make it too perfect. And it's actually the small little imperfections that make it beautiful for what it is.
Yeah, yeah. I think the closest we've come to that is Steely Dan and Earth, Wind and Fire. Maurice White's probably the greatest producer of all time. And in terms of what he built and how he recorded and what he did, and when you listen to a track like Jupiter and you can hear the cowbell and the French horn and the harp and, you know, the gospel choir, there's guys that have done that, and it does take time. It's not like 3 days in the studio and that's it. They take months and months and months to perfect and to re-record and to get the right vibe, tone, approach. You know, it takes a long time. I recorded a track for the late harmonic player Larry Adler, and the track was produced by George Martin. So I was in the studio with George Martin, the George Martin of the Beatles. You know, I mean, in his studio, Air Studios.
Right.
And we started off the day, and I programmed the track, and we laid down the track, and alongside me was Roachwood's producer, great engineer called Faney, and George Martin's son, Giles Martin, who's a fantastic producer. He was also. So it was three of us as producers, young producers, having a go at producing a track for Larry Adler. And this day, sound checking, recording, it was long, but we tried to squeeze a lot into a moment. And we got to about 10 o'clock at night, and we had some background vocals to put on. And we were having a go at these vocals, three vocalists, two female, one male. And it wasn't kind of working, you know? There was just something that was just not right. And I'd arranged it so it was 3-part harmony. And we had a go, and we're all drained by now. And George Martin walked in at that point, and he said, no, this is not how we do it. 3 vocalists, you all sing this line, unison. Then we did another take, and they sung the second line, second harmony, in unison, and then finished off with the third harmony in unison. And it was such a transformative experience for me as a musician to see, to hear, to know how this sound was actually created, this energy, this genius that this guy has in terms of hearing the situation and resolving it as a producer. It was just a fantastic experience. And it was done so quickly because the musicians, the vocalists, the musicians realized what was going on. They found a harmony, a balance between their voices as unison. And as they tracked and built this 3-part harmony, it just sounded so good. And it gave them the vibe and the energy to bring what was turning into an endless session into a very quick and completed mission, you know? And this was a part of George Martin's brilliance. And yeah, I'll be forever grateful for that lesson. It was just so fantastic to see delegation, knowledge, and then execution. And he did that to me. And that's how those records are made. You know, not perfect, scored out, or in this day and age, we have a lot of engineers who record with their eyes using the graph.
Yeah.
You know, lining things up mathematically, bar by bar, recording in grid mode, and then cutting things over. But a lot of the records that I was brought up with were made with musicians in a circle, in a round, getting a balance with each other, not using monitors, not using headphones, and just playing with each other's sound and vibe and emotion. And that's what's recorded. So a lot of the great songs that I've been brought up with were recorded in that way and not using, you know, a waveform. Yeah.
And do you think that's beneficial? Because we have a lot of, you know, people starting out in their careers who watch these things. And, you know, I myself do lectures at universities about technology. And one of the things that I've seen is that the one mic technique, and it's exactly what you've described. You just stick one microphone, Omni microphone, in the middle of the room and go, right, that's what you've got to record with. And they go, well, where's the rest of the mics? And you go, well, that's it. You've got one mic, move everybody else around, and you find your mix using the people, moving them from here to there. And I think that's vitally important, is the fact that actually the worst thing you can possibly do is just look at the screen all the time. You know, use your ears, use the room, use the people, and I think it adds that level of like you started out by saying about the gramophone and how you know it affects you know the effect it had on your hearing and in a positive way, and the way you hear things and frequencies, and actually being able to use the room is much more important than actually going, well, that's what the waveform's doing, so that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to have the waveform. It's great, it really is, and you can get to a lot of information a lot quicker when you open up the waveform and see what's going on. We can edit in syllables, you know. Where we are right now is a great time, you know, to become a scientist in music, in music, in sound. It's just fantastic to be able to do what we're doing right now. But we can't forget, you know, there's that saying about, you know, you can't see the wood for the trees, and Bruce Lee's one about don't concentrate on the finger, you know. You really do have to. And for me, in the jazz world, and they still haven't figured this out yet, you know, what's the difference between his approach and all the other jazz musicians' approach? Well, I actually go to parties. I actually go to stay up at 4 o'clock, going to blues parties and listening and watching what makes people dance and the energies and how the DJs select. And, you know, I follow sound systems. So this is where I'm coming from as a musician, as a scientist of sound. And that's the difference between my approach and a lot of the other jazz musicians' approach, who a lot of them come from colleges and are taught, but a lot of them don't want to go to no raves. They don't want to hang out, you know. They don't want to really get to the basis of what music is all about, reflecting our human spirit.
It's interesting that it's not really a question, but you know, we've just had a comment in from DJ Zylo, who you know, I'm just going to sort of take the first part of it. I think he said, I think it's too easy to lose the essence of capturing emotion to the technological aspects, and I think he's kind of hit the nail on the head there. Is that actually what we're trying to capture is an emotion? Yeah.
I mean, that emotion. And that's why I think jazz will have its place, because when you listen to certain records from the jazz the whole jazz life, there are some records which sound like it's in a room of this size, of that dimension. You know, if you listen to Dave Brubeck's Take 5, you can actually hear the drummer's Tony Morello's foot on the hi-hat. Now, there's not a Lindrum, there's not a drum sample that has drum machine that has that, where you can hear the guy's foot on the drums. You know, my favorite recordings are when you can hear the clacks of the saxophone. You know, you can hear you can hear the guy actually pressing the saxophone. You know, this to me makes it more personal. I want to be in the room with the musicians. You know, they're coming out the speaker at the best quality, but this is what I want to know. You know, I understand that it's taken these guys 6 years to record this album, but I want to hear that environment that they are recording in, and that's the difference between Weather Report's Birdland and the difference between you know, 1 O'Clock Jump by Duke Ellington. You know, that's what sets each record apart, you know. And it's, as engineers, to capture that emotion. I remember back in the day, it was called balanced engineers. So when we're going back to, we're talking about the one mic thing, because a lot of people won't actually understand what does he mean by one mic? How can I record, you know, a 6-piece band with one mic? Well, you stand in the room with the musicians and you find where the energy is, how they set up, and then you put that mic in the right place and then absorb that vibe, you know, and it's humans playing it, not machines playing this music. And that's the difference between those recordings. And I think there is a place for machinations, for electronica sounds. I love drum and bass, for example. And I think with technology, our imaginations can take it to another place. And if you know about drum and bass, or as the Americans laugh, dubstep now, there will always be something else. You know, there will always be something else that you can do with this bit of gear, and you can always twist it in a certain way. My culture, in terms of sound systems, if you went to a party or an event, where the sound system starts, they would start with all the high frequencies. You know, just high frequencies. And the next thing you know, when they put the bass in, it would just be an explosion, and it would really affect your psyche, your body. Yeah. So technology, there is a place for technology. I'm not one of those who's saying, oh, I just want to hear acoustic instruments. I don't want to hear electronic instruments. It's how we utilize these stuff. And like I said before, the instrument stays the same. It's us who actually develop and morph and grow.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that in mind, I'm going to sort of completely rewind now and take, because what I want people to understand is where you've come from and where you are now, because obviously your first solo album was in '86, and you know, that was your first foray into your own sound and your own albums, and then, you know, we evolved into Jazz Warriors. And you know, can you tell us a bit more about that? How that all came about?
Well, I started off. I left school. I was actually kicked out of school whilst doing A-level music, and I joined reggae bands. I became what we call a horn for hire. So a visiting Jamaican artist would need a saxophone player, and I'd be on the bus, and I'd be in Brighton, I'd be in Bradford, I'd be wherever, and playing these horn lines. And my study for jazz just kept on growing. My urge to getting this sound and representing my community through jazz became my modus operandi. Okay, I was still doing sessions as a saxophone player, and then I had the opportunity to make my first album and I wanted to make a acoustic jazz record, and I think that kind of shocked a lot of people. It actually got into the national pop charts, and I became a solo artist, as I've always wanted to be. And then I realized, especially doing the reggae apprenticeship, there were other horn players like me who wanted to be an artist, as they are in America. And the idea for a big band came up. I thought of this idea that we could group together, play our own compositions, and represent who we are en masse. And there were so many musicians. There were so many musicians throughout the UK that wanted to do this. At the time, we had a situation where musicians would become what I would call a super session man, you know, who could sight read anything and do 3 sessions in a day, and then meet up at a jazz club at night over a pint, let their hair down. But there weren't any really solo artists. But I wanted to have a basis where musicians could become solo artists in their own right. And that seemed to happen really quickly and easily. And out of that became another ambition to go to America. And then that happened, and I signed a deal in America, and that was successful. But I wanted to do it from a UK basis, because I felt the energy that we have here in the UK is different to Paris, is different to Los Angeles, is different to New York, is different to Tokyo. So I stayed in the United Kingdom, and out of that became another ambition. It's akin to when you practice, when you learn a new scale, or arpeggio, or a piece. After you do that, you want to do something else. It opens the doors and windows to other forms of exploration. You know, you want to go to after you do grade 5, you want to do grade 6, and then you want to go to grade 8. Yeah. So this is kind of what happened with my career. And I thought, well, I want to, out of my experiences, I want to design my own album cover. I want to have my own recording complex. I want to have my own record company. I want to release other artists, and yeah, I want to take 4K out of my tenor saxophone. I want to do it. I want to have a Manley. I want to have, so my whole career has just constantly opened up other doors to other spaces. And it's just been achievement as far as I'm concerned. But it's not finished yet, because every achievement has opened the door to another achievement. I was actually standing on stage with Herbie Hancock playing music. I mean, that is just unbelievable. I can remember going to the Royal Festival Hall, and a guy came out, an actor, TV actor. He did a program called Hazel, and he said, he thought Herbie was going to play disco music, but he was playing straight ahead music. And I took the tickets and sat in, and I'm on stage with Herbie Hancock in Tokyo, watching him do that thing. So see what I mean about, for me personally, every achievement I've had has just pushed the door open to another achievement, and I think that's the jazz spirit.
Yeah, that's
not
fantastic.
over.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Is that the bar, I think the thing is, the day your career is over is pretty much the day your heart stops beating, and and the bar, unfortunately, wherever that bar is, you're never going to reach that final bar, because you always want to go to the next level, and you always want to do the next thing. So that's fantastic.
And then when you get to speak to Herbie Hancock or Wayne Shorter, when you get to speak to Elvin Jones, John Coltrane's drummer, when you get to speak to them, that's exactly what they say. There's no boundary. Especially with creative music, there's always another sound, another rhythm, another juxtaposition of chords. There's always something else. There's always another composition. There's always another mixture of elements. There's always another musician out there that you'd like to collaborate with. It's never ending.
Yeah. So that kind of nicely leads me on to the next thing. So you've obviously done a lot of diverse projects over the years, but one of the things that sort of highlighted is the project that you did marking the abolition of the slave trade with Jazz Warriors and Afropeans. So, tell us more about that, and how did that come about?
Well, that's an interesting one, because I've been working with the late great John Cumming, who's a promoter for a company called Sirius Productions, and they developed themselves to be the number one production company, I guess, jazz production promoters in Europe, in the world, in actual fact. And this is all down to one guy, and it was a commission, and the idea was that the project would have you got a project for this in mind? And the Jazz Warriors hadn't really performed as an entity for quite a few years. And what had happened was, in that space of time, a whole generation of younglings, as they say in Star Wars, of youngsters had come along, who not only had graduated from university. When I came out of school, you couldn't really go to university to do jazz unless you went to Leeds. But there's a whole generation of young guys that had an energy, knowledge, and courageous enough to go and improvise, to go on stage and bare their souls, had arrived. And I just thought it would be great to get these guys to exemplify the occasion, which was the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. And it was such a great energy. I can remember when the original Jazz Warriors set out, and the amount of stick we got for presenting this sound, this energy. And we got an album out of it, and many guys went on to become solo artists. And this new version of the Jazz Warriors did the same thing. It did the same thing. There are so many artists now that was involved in that band as youngsters, not too sure if they're going to stick in the industry, but they want to play, who are now solo artists, award-winning solo artists who are touring the world. So I think the concept of that band was never to be in the traditional sense where this is all you do. You're going to play in the Jazz Warriors for your life, the rest of your life, and then you can retire. No, this is just a starting point. You know, this is a midpoint in actual fact. The world's your oyster. So come in, bring your composition, solo over it, arrange it, and go. And I had the opportunity to produce a band with members from that called Empirical, and their first album went on to become the album of the year. It's just an energy that, I don't know, it's just jazz, you know. Jazz just makes you want to play, you know. It's just, of all the music that I've played, there's something about jazz that just pulls your soul, you know. It's not just a superficial thing where you're just sight reading something and just playing what somebody else wants. It gets you real deep, you know. And the Afropeans project really exemplified that. It allowed musicians to step forward and express themselves in the way that they wanted to.
Fantastic. That's great. So you also done a project, I don't know how recently this was, but called the Venus Warriors.
Oh, wow. Yes. Yeah, you know about that. Yeah. And it's weird because now it's no big deal, right? But and we're talking like months ago. We're talking maybe like 6-7 years ago. And I know a lot of female musicians, and I really enjoy the energy that they bring to the stage. And for them to actually perform in the jazz world, in a very masculine jazz world, you've either got to be masculine and butch to get up there and play as fast and play as hard and play as loud as the guys, or you just got to do the truth and play what's in your soul. So if you look into the history of jazz, and you look at Matt Partland, you look at oh man, I mean, there's been some great jazz, Alice Coltrane, great female musicians in the history of jazz. Jerry Allen, so sadly, who's passed away recently, who play who they are, and it's relevant to the story of the solo, of the tune, of the composition, to the concert. I just felt it was necessary at the time, 6-7 years ago, to ask these ladies to do a concert, you know, because it just wasn't going to happen. And I talked to them individually, and they were like, nah. And until a rich, you know, a rich typical record company guy would come along with $1 million, it wasn't going to happen. And now I'm not that guy, but I know them all individually. And I don't know how I got. Oh, I know I did. I used my wife. I got my wife to come up with the idea and the name. Once again, she came up with the idea of the Jazz Warriors, the name of the Jazz Warriors, and she came up with the idea of Venus Warriors. And the individuals that took part were all guys that had played with other musicians on the jazz world, but never as a group. You know, they hadn't really thought of, let's just play our tunes at the same time. And so what if we're female? It doesn't make any difference. So I spoke to Fran at great jazz club in Hideaway, which has sadly gone due to this COVID situation. And she said, yeah, you can do it here. So we went down to Streatham, South London, and 10 guys got together, practiced their own tunes, and I stood at the back and witnessed some great music. Now those guys are solo artists. Nubia Garcia is a solo artist. Camilla George is a solo artist. Rosie Turton is a solo artist. You know, I reckon 80% of that band have records out under their own names. And hopefully they were inspired by being in that environment, which is, I think, one of the things that I really enjoy, to inspire people, to inspire themselves, to inspire others. So unfortunately, we didn't record the Venus Warriors, but there's been so many versions of female bands since then. It's just been wonderful to see.
Fantastic. So you mentioned about, inspiring new artists, people that are trying to get into the industry. And, one of the ways of doing that is getting your name out there. And obviously you're a well-known name in the jazz world anyway. But, for people that may not be aware, there's obviously TV work. And I believe you've appeared on Doctor Who.
It's so funny because doing my radio broadcasting times, every now and then there's an American who will say, "Hey, you're that guy that played the saxophone on Silver Nemesis. You're on Doctor Who."
Yeah.
But to get back down to earth, I went to a comic store in Brighton, and there was a section dedicated to Doctor Who, and the guy's looking at me like I'm a thief. He kept following me around the room and stuff. And I wanted to tell him, do you realize that you're actually following the only saxophone player that's ever been in Doctor Who? But, there is opportunities if you're open-minded enough to be in other supposed spheres. I'm standing on stage with the Pet Shop Boys in Tokyo. I'm in the studio with Kate Bush. I'm in the studio with Brian Ferry. I'm on tour with Elton John. I'm a jazz musician, but yet I'm in these spaces where you wouldn't expect to see a jazz musician. But because I come from a different world, I have no airs and graces or snobbiness about, well, I've been practicing 8 hours and you're going to ask me to come and play 3 notes. You're going to ask me to play 8 bars. No, that's a challenge. To play the perfect 8-bar solo in the middle of a Dusty Springfield vocal, or Alan Parker asks you to come and play on the soundtrack to Evita, and play to make Madonna sound good, or to play that thing on Angel Heart. There's a challenge in being in music, and it keeps it so fresh and alive. And it is funny when you're in environments where people don't expect to see you, and you actually do something beyond, So I welcome the challenge, and I practice every day. I still practice to this day, trying to perfect and improve on what I have.
Fantastic. Well, that kind of leads me on to sort of this question about, where we're at now, and the fact that, you are that type of personality that is approachable. You, like you say, your own words, you've got no airs and graces. You want to inspire the next generation, and people can see that. And, obviously, the royalty's seen it, because what was it like to get that letter come through the post that say, we're honouring you with an OBE and a CBE? What was that like?
My manager came round and I nearly fainted. I was like, what is going on here? Because I'm a Westminster boy, born and bred. And that's, going to see the Trooping of the Colours and Madame Two Swords and all that is in my manner that I grew up in. And that was never on the plan, to actually go and stand in front of the Queen and have a conversation. That never really was in my thinking. I want to be creative. I want to be improvised. I want to create an environment where I can make music. But to go and see the Queen? No, that was never in. It still isn't really. I never thought something like that would happen. I've been doing charity shows, and one of them was for a royal gala. And I remember Princess Di walking down. They line us up, and you get to meet Princess Di, right? And she walks along the line, but she stopped at me, not the vocalist, the vocalist is standing next to me, and the other famous people are there. And I'm like the only jazz musician in the room. And she comes and stands in front of me. And she asks me a question. She's like, so what's it going to be like tonight? Are you looking forward to it? And I'm saying to her, like, well, you know what these situations are like. Nobody's listening. Everybody's a bit tipsy. And it's a charity thing. And we're playing in the corner of a room. And I'm talking to Princess Di like she's my girl, like she's a local girl kind of thing. And Princess Di says, well, we'll have to do something about that, and we'll do our best. And it just took me aback that her spirit talked to me in a way that she felt that she could talk to me in that way. So when I got invited to the Palace, there's some proper old school geezers there, right? And I'm there in this queue. You got MBE, OBE, CBE, and the Knighthoods, and I'm in the OBE sector. And there's some proper captains of industry in front of me, behind me, and we're all lined up and stuff. And Brigadier General, I can't remember what his designation is. He says, guys get nervous. This is what you do. So he's proper army geezer, right? And he's like, this is what you do. You start every sentence with Your Majesty. And then you get out there. People get tongue-tied. People lose the plot. Just say Your Majesty and get on with what you've got to do. Answer the question and move on. So I'm in the line waiting. And like I said, there's some proper old school geezers in front of me who's really, really, worked hard and they're getting they're just desserts. And at the end of the line, there's a bottle of vodka. So you could take a shot of vodka and then go and see Her Majesty.
Right.
So I'm just laughing at this whole situation because I'm like, this ain't really happening. I'm in the Matrix and this is not really happening. They're not choosing some geezer from Paddington to come and meet the Queen and talk about jazz. So at some point, somebody's going to jump in the room and say, no, not really. I fooled you. I'm thinking it's all some kind of prank. I've got my morning suit and everything all tied up and, Mrs. in the audience. So I'm there just before the guy in front of me goes off, and then they call up my name. And I walk up, and the Queen says, do people still listen to jazz? And I'm like, yeah, of course they do. There's such a buzz with jazz, everything's blah, blah, blah. Everything's, we're really into it. And there's lots of energy all around the world. People are recognizing us. Your Majesty! I completely forgot the Your Majesty bit. But she was so good, and she really treated me as if she was talking to me, and she knew what she was talking about. And it's only afterwards I realized that Princess Margaret, there's a whole history of jazz. Sidney Bechet played for King George. There's a whole history of the royal family and jazz. So since I said to her, basically, has anybody composed a piece of music for you in the jazz world? And she said, no. And Jody, I have just done an album and I finally pieced together a piece of music for her. And the piece is called Your Majesty. So only you and I will know why it's called Your Majesty.
Yeah. That's fantastic. That's a little bit of a nugget of information. That is superb. Well, I've just got to say, we've only got a few minutes left. But if anybody has any final questions, please do put them in the chat comments now. So, to sort of nicely tie this all up in a bow, what do you think would define Courtney Pine sound? What defines your sound?
Wow, UK, United Kingdom.
Fantastic.
The United Kingdom. The music that I perform is somebody who has an African, Caribbean, European background. So you could be listening to some traditional Nyabingi, Yoruba, I've just done a version of All Through the Night, which is a Welsh anthem, which is a song that my Welsh headmistress, my first headmistress, forced us to sing every day. I've done a version of that on the album. So it's a mixture of all those elements. So when you're listening to a project that I've instigated, it incorporates all those sounds, and I really hope it has no boundaries. You know, it's music that has no boundaries, as far as I'm concerned.
Fantastic. And what can we expect from Courtney in the rest of 2022?
Oh wow. I haven't touched the studio for 2 years and everything fell apart. It's amazing, you know, when you don't touch the machines fight back. They break down.
Oh yeah,
so,
we know about that.
Yeah, so I've had to get almost everything fixed. I've gone through 2 Focusrite Control 24s, and they're lying on the wall right now. They don't want to work, and there's nobody around to fix them. So I'm basically getting back into the groove. I'm going to do a duet album. I did an album 6 years ago with a fantastic Bangladesh pianist, Zoe Rahman. And I've been touring that around the United Kingdom and Europe. And I just love the response to that. I'm playing a bass clarinet and she plays acoustic piano. And it's very simple. It's a very simple project. We play standards, we play songs, and with a bass clarinet and an acoustic piano. So I've decided to not redo that, just have a progression from that by adding a string quartet. And I just recorded the strings at the Church Studios, you know, Dave Stewart's.
Oh yeah, Dave Stewart,
yeah. I did one of my biggest selling saxophone solo is Perfect Day. I never got paid for it. It's a charity record for children in need. Number one for so many weeks. So I decided to finally go back to the Church Studios and record the strings. And I'm currently in the process of mixing that right now. I fancy doing an organ album. You know, in the jazz tradition, we have these organ based classic recordings. Larry Young and Jimmy Smith, and I fancy doing one of those kind of records. So that might be the next one. But honestly, I've got 7 projects sitting down there waiting to be pieced together. So It's very busy, and it looks like we're starting to tour again. It looks like the world is back to having concerts. Somebody's offered me something in Warsaw. So it's more of the same. But for me, when I say more of the same, it's actually learning how to play instruments, learning how to engineering techniques, learning production techniques. I'm still looking out for young artists. I'm very excited about this podcast that I've just started, where I get to hear new releases and present them. So it's not over by a long shot.
Well, that kind of leads me on to my final question, and you kind of touched on it, but I just wondered if there's anything really specific that where you want to take your career going forward, or is it just more creativity, or is there something that you really are shooting for right now?
I would like to do a bass clarinet concerto,
right?
And I've already started work on the clarinet quintet, which is a bass clarinet with string quartet. But the concerto, I've got sketches of that, and there are some really good orchestras around. But that's something that I would really like to see. There are a few bass clarinet concertos out there, but I would love to write one and use my cultural influence to try and present something in a concerto format. you know, yeah, that's something that I'm really looking forward to. Apart from the urge to go and re-record some young artists and produce and present their work. So there is so much more that I would like to do. And strangely enough, I've been asked to present my first album again.
All right, fantastic.
I kind of honored by a jazz magazine, Jazzwise, who want me to be a part of their celebrations, and they've asked me to, you know, do your first album again. And I've never really thought about going back, you know, going back to the first album and presenting that. So yeah, come March, I think I'm going to be doing that. So that's going to be something that's going to be a challenge.
Fantastic. Well, do you know what, Courtney? It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this evening. Thank you so much for your time. I can carry on for another hour, to be perfectly honest with you. But
that's
you know, maybe we can do it again sometime. But to everybody who's been watching, thank you ever so much for watching. This will be available on YouTube if you want to watch it back. And wherever you are, stay safe. And Courtney, thanks again, and speak to you again soon. Take care.
Nice
Good
one,
night.
Jody. Speak to you soon.
Bye now.
Cheers.